And I think it's interesting too, because, as you say there, the text of these laws that they're trying to reinterpret are pretty static. They haven't really changed much in decades. But the ATF's attempts to interpret them and apply them have definitely been all over the place, right? I mean, the big critique that you see in this ruling for the pistol brace rule or ban is that they put in their proposed rule a point system where you could, they still have plenty of criticisms over it, that there were still a lot of sort of subjective measures involved in this point system, but that, there was some way you could look at the gun you have and try to determine whether or not it even fit under this proposed rule about what, is classified as a SBR and what's just a regular firearm. And then they just removed that altogether from the final rule. And of course, before the rule was even proposed, the ATF had been sort of all over the place on the legality of pistol braces, or the legal standing of them. First saying, these are not stocks. They're not designed and intended to be shouldered, which is the key provision separating a short barrel rifle from that's regulated by the National Firearms Act from a firearm that's not regulated by the National Firearms Act. And then they sort of changed that interpretation. They said touching it to your shoulder is a redesign. Then they said it wasn't. And then they put through this rule, and then the rule changed. And you see this over and over again with all three of these examples, right? And I think that's why perhaps the more fertile ground and challenges for these has been over administrative powers, and as well as sort of the rule of lenity, which talks about giving the benefit of the doubt to the person charged with a crime over the government if it's unclear what a statute actually says or how an agency has interpreted it. Is that what you find looking at this, that's perhaps why these challenges have been about procedures or agency power instead of Second Amendment cases under Bruin?
Well, yes, in that, as I say, you've seen a long train of attempts, and therefore it's unlikely the latest one is going to succeed, and therefore it's more likely that the executive branch is going to skip stages. I mean, a good example of this, I know you want to talk about this separately, is this phrase engaged in the business in federal law that determines who is and who is not obliged to become a federal firearms license holder.
Which might be the next, that seems like that might be the next thing that the Biden administration tries to make a rule about.
Right. Now, the interesting thing about that language, I think it was two interesting things that underscore just how difficult this is for the executive branch, and should be under our system of government. The first one is that President Biden, if he does indeed propose a rule here, which he suggested that he was going to a few months ago, would not be the first president to do this. The Obama administration tried the same thing. This was the big announcement they made when they became frustrated that they couldn't convince Congress to change the law. The Obama administration issued press releases. President Obama himself made speeches. They looked into whether or not they could materially alter the definition of who is and who is not obliged to become an FFL. So did the Clinton administration. This is a well to which Democratic administrations have returned over and over again.
Ironically, they're kind of going in the opposite directions, because Clinton wanted to force people to stop being so-called kitchen table dealers, and Obama wanted to force people to become FFLs.
That's right. That's right. But they're all trying to manipulate to their own ends the same piece of language. And then the second reason it's interesting is that this language was actually changed, albeit in a very minor sense, with the bipartisan gun control bill that was passed, was it last year? The year before? Last year.
June 2020.
Yeah, June 2022. but not in a way that allows the Biden administration to do what it currently wants to do. So on that one, the Biden administration wants what he calls universal background checks. Your listeners will know what that means. There is nothing in federal law that permits the federal government to impose universal background checks. Some states have them, other states do not. The Brady Act did not extend to non-commercial intrastate transfers of firearms. The same rules apply to FFLs. My reading of that history is that that was a deliberate attempt to keep the bill within the federal government's explicitly enumerated powers. Others have said it was a quirk of drafting or an oversight, but whatever it was, the law is really clear on this. And this has upset 2 American presidents in a row. Bill Clinton, towards the end of his presidency, did want to move towards so-called universal background checks after Columbine because there was this obsession with gun shows. But it was really too late by the time that he took that up. But Barack Obama was obsessed with this. This was the holy grail of gun control for Barack Obama. Was not a ban on so-called assault weapons, although he did later come to favor that, but was so-called universal background checks. And he couldn't find a way of changing the law. Joe Biden got Congress to change some of the ancillary terms within that provision in federal law, and still there is obviously no way of him doing it. So what did he promise to do? Well, I don't know what he's going to do in practice, but what he promised to do a few months ago was to get as close as he could to universal background checks by redefining this measure. Now you ask, well, why is this? Why has the fight in the courts been mostly over statutory language in the Administrative Procedure Act and not the Second Amendment? Well, the answer is that we've never got to the Second Amendment portion of these fights. We've never got to the merits. If Congress passed a bill that imposed universal background checks, then the case would be on the constitutional merits only. That would be the only question that was put before the courts. Is the federal government allowed to bind the states in this way? In circumstances in which there is no interstate commerce? And is it a violation of the Second Amendment? That's what would go to the court. But with this case, the first question you have to ask was, well, was the president allowed to do this in the first place? And the answer to that just always seems to be no. So, that's why we haven't got to these Second Amendment challenges, because the means by which these ideas are being tried is a violation of Article 1.